Good evening, everyone, and Subha Prabhat to those of you joining from Nepal. Before we get started today, we would like to reach out to our friends, members, and everyone in Nepal who are in the midst of COVID outbreak. Stay safe and healthy, friends. We hope this outbreak will be short-lived. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at Musa Masala for this special event. This is our first live stream event of Thom Pollard on Everest series, and today Thom will be shining light on the mystery of Mallory and Irvine. Were they the first ones to summit Mount Everest in 1924? I got to know Thom while working at Everest ER in 2016. Thom was there for a filming expedition, and we were actually campmates at Everest Base Camp. So while I was busy eating Snickers bars and freshly baked cinnamon buns, no joke, in between seeing patients, Thom was busy feeding those buns to the Everest birds, making a film, imparting his wisdom on all of us, and also summiting Mount Everest. It's my honor to introduce to all of you Thom Pollard. He is an Emmy-winning cinematographer, avid mountaineer, spiritual adventurer, podcaster, and a good friend. Thom was on both 1999 expedition that found the body of George Mallory and also on the 2019 search for Irvine. During this 1 hour long presentation, we'll take a few breaks and tell you about Musa Masala. We'll also test your knowledge on Mount Everest. The link to the quiz is in the comments, and we'll also raffle off some prizes. So stay tuned. And without further ado, I present to you Thom Dharma Pollard. Thom, take it away.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Tatiana. The last time I saw you, here I am. Thank you so much. I'm deeply and so much gratitude to an organization like this and really excited to be here. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And tonight we're going to talk about the mystery of Mallory and Irvine and Mount Everest. I've been obsessed with it for many years, and it's really taken a hold of my heart and soul. And when it comes to the ultimate mystery in adventure and exploration, Mallory and Irvine is really where it's at. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my involvement in trying to solve the great mystery of the disappearance of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine on Everest on June 8th in 1924, almost 100 years ago. The great Everest mystery, Mallory and Irvine, and here it comes. Yes, that beautiful photograph taken by our colleague Jamie McGinnis, a 6-time summiter of Everest. Inspiring. That shot was taken in 2019 as we endeavored to find the body of Sandy Irvine. So let's switch to the next slide. Back in 1921, 22, and 24, George Mallory and the Brits were hoping to find a way to climb Mount Everest, the biggest mountain in the world. And I love this quote because it talks about all things being possible. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. And George Mallory was one such person who didn't listen to the naysayers. He believed that it was possible to climb Mount Everest until many, many decades after he passed away and disappeared with Sandy Irvine. It was still believed that you would die if you went up above 26,000 feet. And Mallory said, the hell with the naysayers, we're going to give it a try. And as you may know, he was the one who is quoted, or at least believed to have said the quote, because it's there. Let's go to the next slide. In 1924, he pulled together this fairly amazing team of a lot of strong mountaineers, some of the best climbers of the day. And it also included the man on the back left there, Sandy Irvine, a young man who was 22 at the time when he got hired, if you will, an Aston, a strong rower, great athlete, and he knew how to fix things. So the fussy oxygen apparatus that was known to stop working at any given time, much like our internet did tonight. But then it was life and death. Here it's just, you know, fun and games a little bit, and a gathering of friends. But and then just to Sandy's left is George Mallory, who's got his foot on Howard Somerville's shoulder, kind of a he was the man running the show, that's for sure. Let's go to the next slide. Mount Everest, this is their view, the first view you get of Mount Everest on the north side. We're in Tibet now, looking south. And as you can see, the mountain has a long approach. You, in essence, go up to the left side of that frame and walk along the ridge toward the top. So you're exposed for many hours to get to the summit and back again. Let's hit the next slide. On June 6th of 1924, this photograph was taken of Mallory and Irvine. This is the last known photograph of Mallory and Irvine. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that not only is Mallory, who's on the left of this photograph, you can see that he's wearing goggles, but also has a spare pair of goggles tucked into his belt. And this is kind of an important piece of information for those trying to determine what time of day he might have died and disappeared. And of course, that's Sandy on the right with 2 oxygen canisters, which hopefully would get them to the top and back down to safety. Let's hit the next slide. So on June 8th, 1924, the last sighting of Mallory and Irvine was at over 28,000 feet. One of their team members, Noel Odell, was down at 26,000 feet, and he looked up and he noticed 2 tiny figures coming up over the ridge at over 28,000 feet. At the time, that was an altitude record. And shortly after he caught that quick vision of them, some clouds came in, a squall, and they disappeared. And that was the last that anybody ever heard of Mallory and Irvine. Next slide, please. And so shortly afterward, a memorial was put in base camp, and this is a much newer one, but now to this day, this memorial stands at the beginning of base camp where people can go and pay their respects to 2 great men who disappeared oh so close to the summit of the greatest mountain in the world. So if we go to the next slide, I'll fast forward 75 years. This ragtag crew of climbers and filmmakers got together. This is a PBS and BBC co-production that we were there. I'm the guy on the lower right looking kind of relaxed, but I was quite nervous actually. It was like getting into the Olympics and climbing and filming with some of the world's best high altitude climbers. And in that expedition team, we already had several people who had already summited Everest before. And Dave Hahn, the guy on the lower left, had already been to the top twice. So since this was my first trip to Mount Everest, I was just a little bit intimidated, hoping that I could just even get to 26,000 feet, let alone to the summit, and do the search for Mallory and Irvine. So next slide, please. And then we get to base camp. Now we're at base camp, and this is from 1999. We're at 17,000, give or take a few hundred feet. And 17,000 feet, for those of you who do or do not know, would be higher than the highest point in the contiguous 48 states. So we're way, way up here. And when you arrive at base camp, you're already pretty knackered. So we spent about 3 or 4 days here acclimatizing. And if we switch to the next slide, I'm going to get right to the meat of it. We needed to get into position for a search that was going to take place on the upper flanks. So now on that tiny little Everest in the distance there, we're going to be in the red part that's still lit on the left side. And so you have to climb up into the North Col. And let's switch to the next slide. And this is on May 1st of 1999. And you can see the guys on the left, they are headed up toward the summit. We're at about 26,000 feet here. And on the right, this is just before leaving Camp 5. at 26,500 feet. Jake Norton there with his oxygen mask on, and the full moon setting in the distance, and the shadow of Everest actually cast into the atmosphere. So we had perfect weather for the search. Let's go to the next slide. The plan was to fan out over a large search area over the span of, probably 8 or 10 football fields. I guess if you're European, it could be European football, but I'm likening it to American football. Just a fairly large space, something that would be easy to do at sea level, but imagine that it's the steepness of a 35 to 45 degrees, and cold, and downsloping shale and rock. So we're walking with crampons, fanning out, going back and forth, looking for a body. And down below, if you could switch to the next slide, at base camp, although this is a slide that I'm using for the picture to tell the story, Jochen Hemleb, our historian who had planned the site where we were going to do the search, would sit down at base camp and peer through that scope and tell us, oh, you should go a little bit to the right, or you should go a little bit to the left, go up, down, or wherever. And so he was literally watching and kind of calling out, hey, try this, try that. And, who's on the top? Who's the guy way up high? And who's the guy way down low? And as it would turn out, Conrad Anker, who was feeling a little bit strong that day, decided to go outside of the search area and dropped below to a lower point. And if you go to the next slide, and a few hours after leaving our Camp 5 in the morning, about 11 something in the morning, Conrad Anker was sitting down having a little snack, and he looked over and he noticed a bright white, looked a little bit like a rock, but it wasn't the color of snow, it wasn't the color of a rock. And as it would turn out, he discovered the body of George Lee Mallory 75 years after his disappearance. To put that into just a tad of perspective, when Mallory passed away with Sandy Irvine, he had 3 children, the oldest of which I believe was only 7 years old. So 75 years had passed, and his kids had grown to be elder citizens of Britain with no knowledge, no information, never knowing what happened to their beloved dad. And so you can imagine that a nation held its breath to find out if we could learn any information. Let's cut to the next slide. I'm only going to show this one slide. We have many, many slides of the site, but this shows, in essence, what the remains of George Mallory was, and one of his boots was missing. I have no idea how that might have happened. His right leg underneath with the boot on was broken in half below the knee. It was an open wound fracture. It was a terrible, terrible fall that he had obviously taken. And our goal, if you could go to the next slide, please. Our goal truly in that situation wasn't really to search the body for signs of contusions or how he might have died, although that was very interesting and part of the film. But our hope was that we could possibly find the camera that we know George Mallory and Sandy Irvine were thought to have carried with them on their summit attempt. And it was believed and told to us by professionals at Kodak Film that if we found that camera and it was in good shape and it had pictures of those two on the summit, that they would in fact 75 years later be able to develop that film. So we looked and looked and looked for that camera to no avail. We were unable to find it. So after a few hours at the body, the team did as much as possible to cover him with rocks and said a prayer as asked by the family of the Mallory and Irvine families. Go to the next slide, please. So you can see here that the summit is, well, it's hard to tell the distance here, but you can see the fall line where we found Mallory at the bottom of that long line that points down, I guess, a little bit like a hockey stick. And he's far, if you will, east of the summit. And for Mallory to have fallen there was both encouraging and discouraging. It means that he was ever so close to their high camp, Camp 6, but far away from the summit. So the conjecture was maybe he turned around and couldn't get back to camp, or maybe they made it to the summit and were completely exhausted and could not get back to camp in the snow squall. So if you could go to the next slide, you can't even imagine that such a discovery was world news. The world was on fire. Several days later, it was on the cover of the New York Times. And our team went from an intrepid group of very ambitious young men and women. There was, our producer from Nova was a woman, Liesl Clark, very, very desirous of just solving the puzzle, to suddenly on the front page of the New York Times. If you go to the next shot, and Conrad Anker, next slide. Yes, Conrad there is shown next to a photograph of George Mallory, and it tells the whole story of the mystery. It was very heady for all of us. So if you go to the next slide, this is all taking place while we're on a mountain that has email, that we get to check email once every week or so. Like, this is early internet days. I called home one time in the 3 months that I was gone, one phone call. So we're getting little tidbits of reports. Oh, you're on the cover of Outside Magazine. You're in Newsweek, Time Magazine, New York Times. 3 book contracts competing for the attention, trying to pull us apart, asking separately, maybe you do a book about this, but you can't give them your information. It was a distressing time, to say the least. And we managed to get through with the world looking. And if you go to the next shot, please, the next slide. We took back with us some of the artifacts, and these were all brought back to the family of the Mallory and Irvine families. And you can see that we found the watch was in George Mallory's pocket with the second hand still on it, and which is, looks like about 1:30ish right there, maybe. And does that mean? But the watch was in his pocket with a broken crystal. And did he break? And then he put it in his pocket. It's really, really hard to say. So we had no real way to say if he had made it to the summit or not. We all wanted to believe that he did, that they did. But home we went. So if we could go to the next slide. We descended back down with the hope of doing some more searching on a future foray. We went back up to the body, did more searching with a metal detector, and Dave Hahn and Conrad were able to make it to the summit as well and complete that. Conrad tried to do a free climb of what's known as the second step. Next slide, please. So the wider view of Mount Everest, I thought to myself, well, this is it. I'll never be on an expedition as famous as this one, but I was positive. There was no doubt in my mind that I would return sometime soon to climb the mountain. And so I had no problem having given up my summit slot to do more searching of the Mallory site. Next slide, please. So to put things in a little bit perspective, how time changes as we wrap up this first half of the presentation, on the right side, that's me coming home to my son, Will, at the time. We were gone about 3 months for this expedition. And it was long enough for a 15-month-old little boy to forget who his dad was. And that hit me pretty hard. It put into perspective the tragedy of the loss of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, and how absolutely just how awful and what a lifetime for his children and the parents and wife and friends of these people not to have any answer to what happened to them, other than what we could tell from having done some photographing and searching of the body. it burned into me, and I always believed that I would have an opportunity to return. I didn't know how long that would take, and as we'll see in the second half of this presentation, I'll show you that we did, in fact, get to return in 2019. And so maybe we could click back to me for a moment. And I believe, Tatiana, I'm not sure if you're going to have some quiz questions. Are we going to do those quiz questions now? And so that's our first half. There she is.
We are doing quiz questions at the end, actually. So we've read them out, but we don't know the answers.
Because of technical difficulties, we're already through the quiz.
You don't even know what happened while you were gone.
All I know is I had no internet, and I thought, hey, what are you gonna do? I've seen tragedies happen. This is not a tragedy when you lose internet, and our lives didn't depend on it. But so are we gonna forge ahead to part 2 of the presentation, or do we need to any video clips that you wanted to show, or did we get through that as well?
I think we can take a quick break and just show our store items.
Let's do that.
And, yeah. We would appreciate any support you guys can give. So please go ahead and check out our store. All the proceeds from the sale of our book actually go towards Wangchu Sherpa Memorial Hospital in the Solukhumbu region of Nepal. So check things out. And I think we are ready for Thom.
Indeed. Yes, those are some good things. I have a buff and a book, but I guess I'm not allowed to compete because I got to see the questions in advance, and I kind of knew the answers anyway. So yeah, so guys, if for those of you watching, look, yes, this is a free event. We're so happy to do this, and it's more than a pleasure to be here presenting, because I love talking about Mount Everest. So I don't really need much of a reason to. And but if you are so inclined, you can go purchase one of these things, but also make a donation to Musa Masala. Their work is amazing. And all the people who are taking part in this broadcast or this virtual cast tonight have put a lot of their heart and soul into it. And I'm honored that they would think that I told a good enough story to keep people, you know, in some kind of rapt attention for the time that I tell the story. And all I know is that part 2, I'm really trying to razz it up a little bit. I'm having a lot of photography from some of the best photographers who have ever lived in the history of mountaineering. And that's not me. I'm going to bring in some of my friends' photography on our 2019 expedition. So let's go. Let's tell the story. Let's go to that slide number 27, that wide shot of Mount Everest. When you get a chance, Kelly. Here we go. 2019 rolls around, and and I'm going to try not to go too long on this build up, but I would often go for runs in the mountains and training, and a lot of times, yeah, like people know that I'm kind of a little bit nutty, but and so you could think, okay, this guy has completely gone off the deep end and he's mad. But I would literally be out on runs in the middle of the mountains, and sometimes I would turn around and I think, gosh, it feels like someone's following me or watching me. And it's not paranoia, I'm telling you. I would literally think that there was this one place on Mount Washington that I called Hobbit Corner because it looked like hobbits could live there. And I always thought, wow, somebody's here. And so I would try to really tap into it. No music, just kind of meditatively training, going up the mountain. And there was this one time when I was going up it that I swear, I just started feeling Sandy Irvine. I was like, wow, it's like Sandy Irvine. And it in my mind, in my heart, having thought so long and hard and about the tragedy of their disappearance, it was as if he was saying, hey, you know, could you help me out here? I need a hand. I'm stuck on the mountain and I want to be free. And you know, maybe I should write a book. It's nonfiction, but it sounds fiction. But I really felt like it was my role to go and and look for him and try to set him free. Whether we found him or not, that was my ambition and what I endeavored to do. So sometime in 2017, I did an Everest presentation in Freiburg, Maine, and I invited my buddy Mark Sinnott, who's a New York Times bestselling author, wrote a book about Alex Honnold's free solo called The Impossible Climb, and now he's written a book about this expedition that I'm going to share with you now. Mark was there and he called me up and he goes, "Do you really think you can find Sandy Irvine?" I'm like, "I know we can, and I'll tell you why. Because this guy, Thom Pollard, one of the great historians in all of mountaineering, who's obsessed with the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, said he thinks he knows where Sandy Irvine is." So let's go to the next slide. So within about a year or so, Mark and I drove to Connecticut to go see Thom and talk about the mystery of Mallory and Irvine. And he said, "You know, things have changed since you were there in 1999. The Chinese are in no way going to entertain any plan of yours to try to locate the body. If you let anybody know what you're doing, they're going to kick you off the mountain or worse. And so you have to keep this under wraps." And so we were enthralled by this. Well, it's like, show us the proof that you have of where the body is. So if we can go to the next slide, Thom had become beyond obsessed, like I just really possessed with the idea that he knew where the body of Sandy Irvine was, and he had taken this photograph that's blown up 8 feet wide, this photograph taken by Bradford Washburn some 20 years previously, 30 years previously, and by studying the photograph, he noticed an abnormality in it that he goes, "This can't be a rock. This has to be it looks soft. It looks like a sleeping bag." Now this is a guy who pored over it with, you see the microscope in the foreground. He would put these slides under, and he's like, "I think that's the body of somebody, and it's not where the body of George Mallory was. I think that's Sandy Irvine." So if you go to the next slide, he put together a couple of eyewitness reports of people going off the standard route of Mount Everest. Now you see to the right is the first step, and that's the first of 3 steps that you need to go by at least on your way to and from the summit. And the normal route is the northern, or the upper one where it says standard. And 2 different times people went a little bit too soon. They took a turn downhill. And on these occasions, these people noticed the body of someone that they believed was another Old English dead. And it could only have been Sandy Irvine, because Mallory, we know, was well below, several hundred feet below, and a little bit to the east. And now that little spot in the middle where it says ice axe, in 1933, an ice axe had been found there, and we know that it was Sandy Irvine's ice axe. So something happened in that exact area. And Thom Pollard, the man who coined the term, the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, was set to find what was going on with that slot. And he figured if he could find a couple of crazy people, crazy enough to take the challenge to go look there, he said that we'd be able to find him. So let's go to the next slide. So we poured through this map, and he said, "This is where this guy went, and this is how you would go down the route, and that circle there represents Sandy Irvine, and all you need to do is go right to that spot, and you're going to find him." And now this is a Genesis moment, just on a whim. Renan Ozturk, who we had brought in, who raised enormous funds from National Geographic and Sony and the North Face to put this expedition on. He goes, "Hey, if we do get all this funding, why don't you bring a camera and film this, like film the conversations with Thom, because maybe it will make it in the film." So it's like, okay, a little more work, but why not? So if you go to the next slide, Mark had been looking at Thom, and he goes, "So Thom, you're telling me if we go to that spot that we're going to find the body of Sandy Irvine?" So that look on Mark's face, literally says it all. I knew in that moment, we're going to Mount Everest. We are going. And Mark and I, in the car the next morning, after we left Thom Holzell's house, we sat in the car and we made a blood pact. Not literally, because that's gross, but we made a promise. No matter what, we were going to go to Everest, even if we had to pay our own way to go, to look for that spot, the slot, if you will, the slash where Sandy Irvine's body was. And fortunately, if you go to the next slide, we we had all the clues that we needed, all the information from Thom Holzell, and put together a team. Go to the next slide. Put together literally one of the greatest teams I have ever been a part of. And this is one last, one of the cameramen, Nick Calise, unfortunately grew ill during the expedition, but this is Renan, Ozturk in the middle, Mark on the right, Jamie McGinnis, if you will, our guide on the left. In the back, down on the lower left is Matt Irving. I'm in the center. And oh, I got it wrong. That's Jamie McGinnis on the lower right. On the upper left is Jim Hurst, sound man extraordinaire. And it was a team that was full of synergy. And so we met in Kathmandu, if you go to the next slide, please, and began pouring through all of the clues, it was actually kind of, it was really a little bit much. I mean, I think we all just wanted to get on the mountain and start climbing, but we poured through every ounce of information, every sighting, every clue that had ever existed about where Mallory was, where Irvine was. And we wanted to make sure that when the time came, when we were boots on the ground on that mountain, we would not have to even whisper a word to each other. We knew where to go. So that scene right there in Kathmandu took place dozens and dozens of times through the course of the expedition. Next slide, please. And now here we are in base camp, doing the same thing, going through. And now that's Thom Holzell's a smaller version of his picture, looking through every possibility. Okay, guys, we're going to go down here. We're going to go down there. And next slide, please. We're in base camp 20 years later, kind of keeping things under wraps now. But we have a secret weapon that didn't exist not only in 1999, but didn't even exist 5 years previously. And if you go to the next slide, and that is the technology of drones. We had with us, now this is a drone. You can, for the most part, buy this drone off the shelf. This is like $1,000, $1,500 drone made by DJI, interestingly, made by a company that's owned in China, and they can tell wherever you fly your drone, so they were probably spying on us. But we were given cursory permission to use the drone, but not written permission, because we were breaking some military codes of ethics by having that drone. And as long as we kept to the rules and filmed only above base camp, we'd be able to use it. So the plan was to take that drone, we had several drones, and do an extensive mapping of the entire north face of Everest, which boots on the ground, which a team of 5 couldn't do in 2 weeks. But with that drone, just by going up and down, a half a dozen times from the relative safety of the North Col, here we are at 23,000 feet where this picture is taken. And, so we could cut a lot of corners. So let's go to the next slide, please. This could be a short video. Yeah, click on this. This is not only did we get to do a lot of research, but we got to film some really, really beautiful things. Hopefully this gets going. So this is a hyperlapse that Renan took of base camp. And so that drone was our secret weapon, but it was also a way for us to film a documentary that, unlike any other documentary that had ever been filmed on Mount Everest. And literally that was our goal, and that was our ambition. If we didn't find anything on the mountain, this would stand truly as one of the great films in the history of Mount Everest and mountaineering. and with somebody like Renan on the team, and Matt Irving, Nick Calise, and Jim Hurst, it was a slam dunk. And now the film is called Lost on Everest. I don't know if any of you have seen it. So let's go to the next slide. So Renan is a little bit of yeah. I don't know if you're gonna have to click down to that without. Yeah, there you go. Boom. Hit that little arrow. There you go. Boom. Number 40. Yeah. So Renan is one of those guys who you'd just think that you were done with your work for the day, and all of a sudden you'd hear the drone fire up, and that. I'll be damned if that guy didn't fly the drone every time there was a full battery. He had cameras on time lapse up and down the mountain, constantly working to make sure that we had the most beautiful end product, if not evidence of, if you go to the next slide, of the body of Sandy Irvine, which was really our ultimate goal. And so now this is a drone shot taken well over the North Col, probably, we're probably at 27,500 feet here. And so anybody who has any familiarity with drones knows that the company, the DJI or any drone company, puts a ceiling on how high you can fly a drone. I believe the standard is 500 meters. So a goofball who buys a drone can't take that drone and fly it up into airspace and knock a Piper Cub out of the sky or worse. But we worked tirelessly, and I say we, I use that term very lightly. I had nothing to do with it. Matt and Renan and some of the people at home worked endlessly to try to literally crack the code of the software in the drone, and at the same time ask the company for permission to give us the code. And it's funny, on the same day we got both. We cracked the code and they gave us permission. So I like to say for intrigue that we cracked the code, but they actually acquiesced and gave us the permission. So we were able to fly $1,000+ drone up and over to the summit of Mount Everest, 29,000 feet. And the only reason we didn't really go up any further than that was because that drone weighs about 0.5 pound, and even a puff of wind would blow that thing well down into Nepal. So let's go to the next slide. After we did a ton of drone photography across the North Face, we poured through all the photographs, and these photographs were such high definition that you could zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and on your entire, so you can see me on the right, Matt on the left, you could zoom that entire screen on your computer and it would be about 10 feet of rock on the North Face of Everest. And so if you took one slide, you could spend an hour and a half on a slide just going through little squares. And we found a body, we found ropes, we found carabiners. It was that high resolution. Now go to the next slide, please. And while we searched, just in case it became a scene in the film, Renan would ask Mark to come out of his little guest house room and say, okay, we're going to film a scene of you looking at the computer now. And the cool thing about this is, while we were searching our cameras and resting from our trips up to altitude, most of the other teams on the mountain were moving their way up in position to get into position for the summit. So let's go to the next slide, please. You could see really the perspective that we had. You can imagine in 1999, it was literally boots on the ground with crampons, scanning across very steep, dangerous, although not that technical, but steep terrain where if you fell, you would definitely 100% slam dunk die. Because if you kicked a little rock or a pebble, you'd watch it go down from your crampon and it would just tumble, and you just hear it tumble away into nothingness. So we were hell bent on as much safety as we possibly could make on the mountain. So if you go to the next slide, I didn't want to zoom in all the way here, but you can see this is basically the process. We just keep zooming in and zooming in, and I don't know if this slide has that body in it, but we had one of the slides that we had did have the body of a Japanese climber that Mark ended up using as a waypoint when he went off the rope to look for Sandy Irvine. So that sighting of this climber who had perished some years before came invaluable to Mark in his search. We go to the next slide, please. So we worked our way back up the mountain now. There you see Everest off in the distance, and we're probably at about 20,000 feet here. That's Sir James Hurst making his way up the medial moraine of the East Rongbuk Glacier. And so we were well rested, very acclimatized, and the other climbers were moving their way, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier. And for any of you who follow the Mount Everest lore and saga, on 23rd of May, well, that ended up being probably the first good summit day of the year. If anybody's following it this year, there's already been several good summit days, and teams as we speak are mobilizing and moving up from Camp 2, literally at this moment, moving up to Camp 3, hopefully going to summit in a day or two on the south side. The north is closed again this year. But on May 23rd, everybody, literally everybody on the entire mountain, except for the Sandy Irvine search expedition, was going for the summit. So if you go to the next slide, and this is what it looked like below the Hillary Step. This now famous or infamous photograph of the logjam, as many people called it, Mark called it the conga line up Everest, which ultimately led to the deaths of many people. I believe the total deaths on the mountain in 19 was 11 climbers, but on this very day, those people were out exposed, not moving, for probably 4 or 5 more hours more than they would have had to wait had there been no line. And so we are quite sure, and we've got doctors who are helping put the show on. I interviewed Peter Hackett, the foremost authority on altitude physiology, and he said absolutely that this led to the sudden death of at least 2, probably 3, maybe 4 people that day. It was a very tragic day, and we watched from below. And as those people filtered off the mountain, we were ready now to go up. So if you go to the next slide. And now I just want to do a little bit of an aside. I talk about it kind of offhandedly, like it's, no emotion, or, these people died and everything. And I'm really trying to put out as much information as I possibly can. I don't want to take away from the fact that it was an absolute tragedy. We were deeply moved and really thought a lot about our own mortality in that time, and questioned, were we in the right to continue going back up the mountain? And we sat and spoke and discussed this for many, many hours over the course of days, and decided that, given our experience and our commitment to safety, that we were going to do it. And we literally had the mountain to ourselves. By the time we got to this point, this is the North Col at 23,000 feet in elevation, right exactly where the last photograph ever taken of Mallory and Irvine was taken almost 100 years previous.
As it would turn out, in the day or so where we were planning to move up, I had the symptoms that would turn out to be 50-50, either a TIA or a migraine, but it was hard for the doctors remotely to determine what it actually was. The problem with not knowing specifically was that if it was a migraine, it would be no big deal, and it wouldn't even cause me headache pain. It was just more of something to do with the blood flow. But if it was a TIA and those conditions returned during our summit bid, that would mean sure death for me if that happened at altitude. So the decision was made fairly easy for me to go back down to base camp and, if you will, monitor them during their summit bid and their successive search for the location where we believed the body of Sandy Irvine was. It was heartbreaking for me, and we had quite a session to determine whether I was going to go down or not. And it made prudent decision. I had already been to the summit in 2016, so certainly it wasn't the summit. It wasn't worth the risk. I have 2 children, and what's worth the risk? I don't want to end up like one of the many people who never come home with children back waiting for them. So the team makes their way up, and now, as I may have mentioned, the mountain is virtually empty now. There's nobody else on the mountain at all at this given time. And you can see these tents that are set up in different areas, and these tents are the remains of other teams that abandoned them on a hasty descent as high winds came in. So that allowed our team to ascend lightly and not carrying a lot of extra equipment. The ascent above to the summit is spectacular. You can see the festoons coming up over the North Ridge, climbing into the morning as the sun rises up over the horizon, Makalu in the background. Some of the Sherpa who were on our expedition team, who made everything so much better and knew their way around the mountain, certainly there they are celebrating at the top.
So we are on the summit of Chomolungma, mother goddess of mountains right now. The team made it. I awaited impatiently in base camp listening to their transmissions, and that's Mark Sinnott, the man who's going to do the search off the fixed ropes for the body of Sandy Irvine, and they are knackered. And Mark and Renan are 2 of the greatest climbers in the world. Well, it's certainly American climbers, and both of them will readily tell you this is about the hardest thing that they have ever done. So while there are fixed ropes, indeed, going to the top of Everest, it is no piece of cake. And so now Mark has to do the hardest part of the trip on the way down. Let's go to the next shot, please. And so Matt and Renan filmed Mark as he pondered what it was he was about to do. When you're on the fixed lines, you can fall, you can slip, and it doesn't really matter. But the minute he unclips from that fixed line, you're, on thin ice, so to speak. Next slide, please. He sat, thought about it a little bit, clipped in. And in the next slide, when you go to that, you can see that he got his GPS out, and just out of frame purposefully was the body of the Japanese climber that Mark used as a waypoint. And he oriented himself, stood up, and go to the next slide, please, and unclipped from the rope, much to the dismay of one of the Sherpas, Lakpa Sherpa, the head climbing Sherpa, who was very vociferous on telling Mark not to do it. I think he knew that Mark had the climbing skills and ability to do everything that he set out to do, but to kind of play it safe, if you will, he had to make sure that it was not within his belief that anybody should ever unclip, just kind of covering his tracks, if you will. It made a very dramatic scene in the film if you've ever seen Lost on Everest. So the next slide, please. Now you can kind of see it's not really steep. It's not even as steep as a roof. Like if you ever walk in the wintertime, the kids and I would get up on the roof of our garage and shovel it off, and even the dog would go up on the roof, but you could sit down and it wasn't dangerous. But if Mark were to slip right here, it's over. He's gone. And he certainly went to the other side on that day and searched and searched. Next slide, please. And dropped down, a couple of 100 feet to that site where those sightings were. and he believes that he definitively found the slot that Thom Holzel had identified.
But wouldn't you know it, when Mark did get to that slot, there was nothing there. And so either Thom Holzel was wrong, and we don't believe he was. We believe his information was precise about the two previous encounters that had happened at that exact location, or, as had been reported to us in base camp during the expedition, that the Chinese had sent a team there some years before to actually remove the body. The mystery intensifies, so we really don't know, but Mark at least went to go and look for Irvine. He was not there, and it is our belief that, given all the information that we amassed that's written in Mark's book called The Third Pole: Mystery, Obsession, and Death on Mount Everest, that due to the research and what we discovered, that we pretty much closed the chapter on ever needing to go up that face again to look for Sandy Irvine or the camera. On June 3rd, on the day after the team arrived safely back to base camp from the summit, Mark and I and Renan and Matt Irving and Jim Hurst, the entire film crew, went back to the site of the George Mallory and Sandy Irvine Memorial to pay our respects and to film a scene that was included in the final film that you can see. It's a National Geographic film called Lost on Everest, and it is now, as of May 2021, available on Disney Plus. And so we leave behind us a beautiful parting shot of Chomolungma, and that's Mark and I on the very bottom of the frame, tiny figures dwarfed by the beautiful and dangerous and mysterious mother goddess of mountains, Chomolungma, with thoughts of the beautiful people who have disappeared there, especially George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, who were the most brave and intrepid men to try and summit first. So the mystery remains. Do you think that they made it? It would be impossible for anyone to say that they did not. It would also be impossible for anyone to say that they did. So when somebody puts their mind to something, when somebody truly desires something and puts their heart and soul into it, it's unimaginable what an individual is capable of accomplishing. And it would not doubt me if definitive proof should surface someday showing one or both of them standing at the summit of Mount Everest. I will leave you with a lovely time lapse filmed by Renan Ozturk at Advanced Base Camp at 21,000 feet of the Milky Way, passing up over Chomolungma, Mount Everest. And as that plays, I want to say thank you for being here. I am deeply honored to have this opportunity to share my story with you. Please visit musamasala.com, and if you can make a donation or buy something from them to help support their incredibly noble mission, that would be beyond, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much, and to all, I truly appreciate you being here.
And I know we are way over our time, so thank you so much for sticking around with us over here. Thank you, everyone behind the scenes, Kelly and Julie for the artwork, and Mike G. And please, guys, do check us out, our store, and donate to support our future projects. Next time, our next show is going to be June 17th, and we will be talking about Mount Everest and environment. So June 17th, same time, we are going to talk about Everest cleanup and pollution in the area. So join us.